Hi, everybody. Jim Ostrowski with the Liberty Moving podcast. Kind of bright today. I normally don't do podcasts at this time of day. It's hard to see the screen, which you might say, well, that's great because all I see is my face. So we're going to talk a little bit about the new Pope and how to help the poor. Just a disclaimer, I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to talk about theology very long. This is really, to me, it's about economics and politics, which is two topics that I believe I have a background in. Let's put it that way. So, first of all, I will talk a little bit about, as much as I know about theology and the poor and the government and the welfare state. So, just as somebody who has the Catholics' casual familiarity with the New Testament, as far as I know, I've been saying this for 15 years and nobody's ever contradicted me. So if I'm wrong, you tell me. So my assertion is, my belief is that Jesus never said anything about what the government should do. So people sort of leap to that conclusion that being a Catholic requires you to be concerned for the poor and the downtrodden, which is undoubtedly true, but but it doesn't it doesn't mandate or suggest or even imply that personal ethical obligation that you have, you can foist that onto the agency of the monopoly on the use of force, which is the government. The government is an agency which has a monopoly on the use of force. And if you think that you have some Christian obligation to basically use the government to steal other people's money to fulfill your own personal religious obligation, all I can say is, though I'm not a theologian, I think you are sadly mistaken. I think you are, I'm going to run across the street here. Sadly mistaken. But I'm not a theologian. You're going to have to make that theological argument. So really, I just want to talk about the Pope. The new Pope has expressed concern about Catholics' ethical obligation to the poor. And that concept has a long tradition in the Catholic Church going back to the New Testament. So, if you are a Catholic, and I'm not speaking to, I'm just really talking about Catholics at this point. I normally don't talk about religion, but that's the context of the subject. That's the subject we're talking about. What should the Pope do to help the poor? But really, look, I know the Pope isn't going to, he might listen to the podcast, or his staff will, but he's not going to do what I suggest. So I'm really talking about what Catholics generally can do to help the poor. And I have to concede, I maybe in an excessive self-confidence, I have done virtually no preparation for this podcast. If I don't know this stuff by now, it's pretty much hopeless. So let's break it up into two parts and talk about how best you as a Catholic can personally help the poor. Well, so again, this notion that, Jesus was like a big government progressive or, believed in the Great Society and all that, really there's no theological basis for that. But so one of the things that handicaps, let's talk about freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is usually narrowly construed to mean the government can't interfere with your religious practices, going to church, praying, and things of that nature. And then there's some collateral issues. But in a broader sense, in my contention, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to make this argument, but I'm making it anyway. I don't know who to cite because I I'm not familiar with who's made this argument. I'm certain it's been made that in order to exercise your religion, particularly if you're a Catholic, you don't just need freedom, to go to church and send your kids to a Catholic school and all that stuff. You need freedom, period. You need freedom, period. If you're going to help the poor, you have to have money. You have to have property. And so the first thing that Catholics need to do to fulfill their religious ethical obligation to help the poor is to advocate for a society where the individual has liberty. And what's liberty? Well, we don't have it now. We're not even remotely close to that. But liberty, there wasn't really a good definition, so I came up with one myself. And it is as follows. Liberty is the ability or the right to do what you wish with what you own. So being able to do what you wish with what you own. It's so funny, one time I quoted that and somebody responded by quoting Jefferson's much more complicated, I don't want to say convoluted, but maybe circular argument. And it's okay, I guess it's pointless to try to get things down to an elevator pitch because people want the old complicated definition of liberty, which nobody really understands. So point one is, again, if you're going to, let me talk a little bit about the welfare state. So my contention is that one of the reasons why some people actually support the welfare state, not for any for selfish reasons, is that a lot of people don't want to have anything to do with the poor. It's like they don't want to personally get involved. They don't want to stop on the street and help somebody out. They'd rather push that off to some agency. And I don't think that's what, and again, I hate to drift off into theology, but I don't think that's the import of the New Testament. I think, it's my opinion, and it is theology, in my humble opinion, I believe that the Christian obligation to help the poor is directed at you personally helping the poor. And again, in order to do that, what do you need? If you're a slave, if you're a tax slave, if every spare dollar you have is basically seized by the government, or much of your wealth is destroyed by regulation, then you're going to be inhibited and hampered in your ability to fulfill your religious obligation. So, point one, in order to fulfill your obligation to help the poor in the personal sense, I think it's pretty obvious that you must support assistance, but generally speaking, you're allowed to do what you wish with what you own. It doesn't mean you can steal something. I want to own somebody else's property. No, it's already sort of covered in the definition. There's really no wiggle room there. So that's point one. Let's talk about point two. It's almost the same as point one, but with a slightly different emphasis and a slightly different point of view. So, if you want to help the poor, first of all, you have to ask, well, why are people poor? Well, there's always going to be poor, as Jesus said, but we don't always have to have masses of poor people. And I think that's been proven. So if you take a quick look at the countries that have the highest poverty, what's pretty obvious if you're not blinded by ideology, as many people are blinded by ideology, because one of the functions of certain ideologies, for example, progressivism, one of the functions of progressivism is to sort of disable your mind from seeing certain things, because if you see those certain things, you might not believe in your ideology anymore. Ideologies are very jealous of competition. So we have to ask, is there a relationship between liberty and poverty? And the answer is yes. If you go to, there's various indexes of economic liberty. I'm not going to rattle them off. Ask Grok or ask Google. And you'll find that the freest countries, such as Switzerland, United States, Australia, Canada, you may not think of Australia, Canada as particularly free countries economically, but relatively speaking, they are. The United States is not a free market country. That's a rank-fetid lie. But relatively speaking, the United States is a free market country because there's so few even mixed economies in the world. So basically you'll find, and I'm not going to belabor the detail because this is a broad-themed discussion. If I can follow it up later if I leave anything out. But you'll find that the countries with the lowest amount of poverty have the most economic freedom. So so a Catholic should support true free market economics, not capitalism, whatever that means, not the mixed economy, not the corporate state, but true, actual free market economics. That's, my opinion, it's your theological duty. Many will disagree. That's fine. Have at it. Show me how I'm wrong. So let's drill down. So let's talk about third world countries, and then we'll talk about first world countries. So basically, if you look at the poorest countries, I looked at Peru just an hour ago through Grok, and I was a little surprised. Peru is not as dreadful because that's where the Pope Leo did his missionary work. Peru is not as terrible on economic liberty as one might imagine, but it is quite down on the list. I think it's like, 60th, something like that. And on corruption, which is directly relevant to this discussion, it's even worse than that. So I almost kind of question whether they've quite caught the extent of the taxes, regulation, inflation, and all the other restrictions on the Peruvian economy, because I have sort of a friendly amendment to Lord Acton's great aphorism that power corrupts. My friendly amendment is that power is corruption. Power is corruption. But it also leads to corruption in the sense of the need to bribe public officials and so on to get a license. If it take you 2 years, imagine if it takes you 2 years to get a business license. Well, first of all, why need a license at all? That's totally stupid. We need to get rid of that. But the Peruvian economy is highly regulated. I assume it's highly taxed due to the rankings. I haven't studied the details. I've studied the broad ranking, which factors in on all forms of government intervention into the economy. So you'll find basically that most of the countries in the world that have dire poverty or extreme, or however you want to, whatever adjective you want to put on it, where the poor people are a hell of a lot poorer there than they are in the poor people are in the United States. You'll basically find that most of these countries, regardless of the form of government, because democracy, let's face it, democracy is a bit of a sham. America has a democracy, but we essentially have an oligarchy. That's been proven by political scientists. The rich and the powerful determine policy, regardless of who votes. But basically, if you look at these third world countries like Peru and some of the countries in Asia and Africa, what you find is basically they're kleptocracies, where some man or woman or party or the military has seized power and they rule by brute force, and they basically use the government to steal from the population for the benefit of themselves and their allies and so on. So these are kleptocracies. Now the interesting thing is, one of the things you find in these third world kleptocracies, let's put it the opposite way. One of the things you won't find in a poor third world kleptocracy where the masses are suffering and have been suffering for decades, if not centuries, is a right to bear arms. You may think, well, what does that have to do with poverty? Well, it has everything to do with poverty. Because if you have this kleptocracy and the people are living miserable, brutally miserable lives to the point where many of them have to think they're forced or are forced to, illegally immigrate to the United States to escape that poverty. What you find is, again, the citizens are not armed. So the notion of having like a Lockean revolution against tyranny is really almost impossible. And I think the situation in Burma proved that, where you had massive resistance, non-violent resistance to the coup a couple of years ago. And it really kind of failed, and they decided they had to start smuggling in some guns, and that thing's still going on. I don't know the exact status of it. But, so what you find in these third world corrupt kleptocracies is that the citizenry does not have a right to bear arms. The government's loaded, armed to the teeth. There may be criminal gangs that are armed to the teeth. There may be insurgents who are armed to the teeth. But the average person is not armed to the teeth. So, in all honesty, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but if Catholics are really concerned about the poor in the third world, they should support a global right to bear arms, which, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, concept that I developed myself, at least that word, I believe. And that's hashtagged on Twitter and so on, so if you want to support that. And you can read my book, my current book explains all the details. So what else does the third world lack? Well, many of these countries are the subject of invasion from other countries, often at the behest of the United States, and that has caused miserable poverty. And you also, particularly in the Latin American countries, you have the extended effects of the idiotic American drug war, which was, let me adjust this a little bit. So the drug war really was started by Woodrow Wilson. A lot of the people don't understand that, but because they haven't done the research. Don't be lazy now, do some research before you opine. So again, you got these corrupt third world kleptocracies where there's poverty. And all of a sudden, somebody living in the ghetto in Peru or whatever country, maybe they can make a few bucks by selling cocaine to the cartel, and it ends up in Miami, New York, or Kansas, wherever. So, and that also, the drug war also causes a lot of instability in these countries and violence, what's the old, how do I put this? Poverty doesn't cause crime. Crime causes poverty. If you have a lot of violence, nobody wants to do business there. They're going to, like for example, after the riots in 1969, like the business district in Newark just shut down. Everybody closed the stores. Same in Buffalo. Same in almost every city that had it. These businesses closed. Nobody wants to do business when you're going to get rocks thrown through your window and beaten up or whatever. So those are some of the, I'm not going to belabor this too much longer. So that's sort of a picture of what it's like in the third world. So, well, the other thing I'm leaving out, which is sort of obvious, but what the third world needs to escape poverty is individual liberty, in economic liberty. And so that's what the Catholic Church needs to advocate for. They need to advocate for the right of the third world poor to work without, the Catholic Church is sort of wedded to unions. We could talk about unions all day long. But what the poor in the third world they need economic liberty. They need the right to start a business without an expensive license or without a license at all. They need the ability to not suffer from ridiculous regulations, excessive regulations. they need the ability to keep the fruits of their labor so they can feed their families, but also reinvest the profits into the business so the business can grow. And none of those rights exist now. You have excessive regulation, excessive licensing, excessive taxation. You have to bribe inspectors. Maybe you don't have $10 to bribe an inspector in Peru. So I think the Pope, being a very intelligent fellow, probably already knows this, but I don't expect him to suddenly, go all libertarian in his encyclicals. So that covers the situation in the third world. I'm just going to end by talking about first world countries, because even though our, the United States and Australia are relatively wealthy, there's still an underclass. So what do we do to help those? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the war on poverty is a failure, and basically all it did was get people dependent generation after generation. And they never got out of poverty, first of all. The neighborhoods that supposedly were supposed to be helped by the Great Society haven't progressed, in fact have declined. And I know that I can say from personal experience in Buffalo, because I've been through all those neighborhoods. I did a podcast through those neighborhoods like 2 years ago. But worse than that is in addition to failing to improve poverty or economic conditions, they broke up the family because of the government became the daddy. There were some regulations about you can't get welfare if there's a father in the home. Okay, well, there's no father in the home. That can be arranged. And that was arranged. So the war on poverty failed. So again, what we need in the United States is that the poor need to be free. They need to be free to start a business. And I'll give you one object lesson. So when I was in college, a job I briefly had, I had to give it up because I cannot work nights. It's just brutal. I really have a lot of admiration for people who can work nights, because I cannot. But I was able to get a security job very easily in Buffalo when I was in college. And, it may be a few bucks. I gave up the job a few weeks later, but it's irrelevant to my point. Now you've got probably the large security companies lobbied for regulation. So now in order to become a security guard, you got to take a test. You got to be, instead of being trained by the company, you've got to pay a licensing fee. Well, what if you don't have the licensing fee? I mean, if you're poor, you may not have the licensing fee. You may not have the education to pass the test. So that first rung into the economy is so difficult now with the highly regulated labor market that we have. So the first thing we have to do is make it easy to get a job. We need to make it easy to, sorry, this thing's driving me crazy. Make it easy to start a business. Because many of the people who came over in dire poverty as immigrants in the early 20th century, maybe they started an apple cart and they saved a couple of bucks and they bought a couple of apple carts, and the next thing you knew, they owned a deli. Well, they had the ability to reinvest those small profits that they made because there was no freaking income tax. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. So basically, I think it's pretty obvious that to help the poor, even in first world countries, same thing. You need economic liberty. The poor need, as Ayn Rand said, what the poor have not, what the have-nots have not is liberty. So true. It may be, a quote, but it's a true quote. It's an aphorism, short statement that expresses the actual truth. So I'm going to leave it at that. Basically, if Catholics, whether you're the Pope or whether you're me or whether you're any other sort of Catholic, in order to help the poor, the first thing you need to do is create economic liberty for the poor and for people who want to help the poor. The poor that'll reduce their level of poverty, and people who want to help the poor will have more money to help them in ways that are more efficient than the welfare state, which basically has been a colossal failure since LBJ put it into practice in the mid-'60s. So that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for listening, everybody.